try. No, this isn't working, is it? I'll stand here. Can I use that? Is that? Try. Is it on? It always helps if you turn it on, doesn't it? It's absolutely fabulous to be here with you all this morning. I'm Paula. I work at St. Paul's Cathedral. And when I'm not working at St. Paul's Cathedral, I am a New Testament scholar. And I wrote a book last year, and I want us to reflect together on some of the themes in the book that I wrote. Not that I've expected that any of you have read it. I'm going to tell you about them. So the book that I wrote last year is called Women of Nativity. And what I was doing in the book was I told 9 stories of women. Stories of women whose names we know. Stories of women stories of women whose name we know and we know them quite well. Stories of women whose name we know and most people have never heard of. And stories of women who were probably there, and if we look for them carefully in the text, we can find them. So what I want to do this morning is tell you a little bit about those 3 types of women in connection to the Christmas story, and then to reflect on what that tells us about how we read Scripture, about what we think about when we're reading Scripture, and how we understand ourselves. So, the first thing I need to do is just explain to you a little bit about why I chose certain women and not other women for this story. So we'll start with the Advent candles. So you associate with the Advent candles hope, peace, joy, and love. There are other things you can associate with Advent candles. And in some churches, what they do is they associate characters from the Bible with the 4 different candles. So on the first Sunday of Advent, often they will associate the patriarchs, at which point I want to add, and the matriarchs. So the patriarchs and the matriarchs are... brain goes blank as soon as you start saying that. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, and Jacob, thank you. My brain is not functioning fully this morning. Jacob and Rachel and Leah. So the patriarchs and the matriarchs are the ancient people of the faith. Then the second Advent candle is associated with the prophets. The third with John the Baptist, and the fourth with Mary. So you'll see that, therefore, in our 4 Advent candles, the 4th one is the only one that actually is normally named with an association with a woman. And then we go through into the Christmas story, and we tell the story of Jesus' birth and the things that happen after them. And I just want to go through this morning the different people that I reflected on in my book, The Women of the Nativity, and pull out a few themes for you because I think there's some really interesting ones. So I'm going to start with the women whose names we know, who we all know. So I'm going to start confidently with Mary. I think we can all agree that we've heard of Mary. The second one is somebody that you probably have heard of, but you may not have thought about very much, and that is the mother of John the Baptist. Shall we just do a little trivia quiz for the morning? A mother of John the Baptist. It gets harder as we go on, so if you know the answer to this one, shout quickly. The mother of John the Baptist is called... Excellent, there we go. Nice and straightforward. And then we have someone else whose name we know, who is less well known than Mary and Elizabeth, but nevertheless still quite important. After Jesus' birth, when Mary and Joseph went into the temple, they met 2 people. One of them was called Simeon, and the other one was called Anna. Excellent. And so there we have our 3 women whose names we know and who are known quite well. Mary, we know quite a lot about. Elizabeth, fascinatingly, we know very little about, but if you read very carefully, you can tell some interesting things about her. So the first thing we know about Elizabeth is that she comes from a priestly family and is married to a priest. And if you have a look at Luke's gospel, you will see that Elizabeth can trace her lineage all the way back to Aaron, whereas her priestly husband, who's called Zechariah, can't trace his family back quite that far. And in my story, I imagine what happens when Elizabeth points out that she goes all the way back to Aaron, and Zechariah can't quite manage that. But one of the themes that comes out quite strongly in the Bible when we're looking at stories of women are the stories of the women who can't have children. And one of the things that I often feel really kind of acutely when we're reading stories about women who can't have children is the kinds of words that are used. And one of my great campaigns is to try and get the Bible translated better when it affects some of those really big issues. The word barren is just a horrible word, and I think we shouldn't be using it when we're reading about the Bible. And there are other words that you could use instead. So one of the things I often try and argue is that we could try with our translations to think about what it must have felt like for somebody like Elizabeth. If the only thing that you can ever recall of a woman is the fact that she wasn't able to have children. What an awful thing to be remembered 2,000 years later for. So one of the things I would really encourage us when we're reading the Bible is just to be very careful about how we look at those kinds of words and reflect on them. And then we come on to Anna. And Anna is one of my absolute favourites. And one of my bugbears when people talk about Anna and Simeon is people take stuff about Anna and they put it onto Simeon. So when they talk about Simeon, one of the things that they will say is that Simeon was a prophet. Luke doesn't say that. It says that Anna was a prophet. We also assume that Simeon was very old. If you know any art about Simeon, you will see that he is represented as a very old man. Doesn't say that in Luke. It says Anna was old. Doesn't say anything about Simeon. Let me just tell you about Anna being very old, because I think Anna, that bit is really interesting. Again, it's not entirely clear exactly how old Anna was, because what it says is that Anna was a widow of 84 years. Literally, in the Greek, it says that. So the question is, does it mean that she was a widow who was 84 years? Or that she was somebody who was a widow who had been a widow for 84 years. So basically, you've either got Anna being old or incredibly old. Because if you think that a woman would have been married at an age kind of 13, 14, she was married for 7 years and then was a widow for 84 years, my maths doesn't quite do it, but she's over 100. So as I say, she's either 84 or she is over 100. And what Luke tells us about Anna, and this is why I absolutely love the story of Anna, is that she has been in the temple fasting and praying over and over again for those 84 years. Simeon, in contrast, was driven there by the Spirit, according to Luke. So he was about his everyday life. The Spirit suddenly spoke to him, and off he tootled to the temple. And we associate with Simeon kind of the same thing that we associate with Anna. Simeon's a Johnny-come-lately. He just gets driven into the temple and encounters Jesus. And what I love about the story of both Anna and Simeon is that you get the patterns of two very strikingly different bits of faithful people, both equally important, both really striking. Simeon, inspired by the Spirit, comes in and recognizes who Jesus is. Anna has been studying the scriptures. The woman, incidentally, has been studying the scriptures for 84 years. And as she fasts and prays, that's how she recognizes Jesus. Driven in by the Spirit, studied for years and years, both equally good, both equally important, and that gives you that sense of who they are and why they're significant. So we have, therefore, women who we know really well, whose names we know. But there are also women whose names are known in the Bible who we don't know very well. And one of the things that I often do when I'm talking about prophets is I talk about female prophets in the Bible. And I told you your trivia quiz was about to get harder. Now's your harder trivia quiz for the morning. Female prophets in the Bible. People who would like to jump in quick, I've just told you somebody who is a female prophet who's mentioned in the Bible, whose name is Anna. Yay! So we start strong. Anyone, any advance on female named prophets in the Bible? Old Testament as well as New Testament. Deborah. Yes, we've got Deborah. Esther, interestingly, isn't named as a prophet. I think she acts as a prophet, but no, she isn't named explicitly as a prophet. No, again, not named as a prophet. Think Moses' sister, Miriam. So we've got Miriam, and we've got Deborah. And then we've got, in the Old Testament, 2 more named prophets. There really is the gold star, if you know them. Yes. There we go, gold star on the front row. Huldah, who I'm about to talk to you about in a moment. You can tell I'm from Manchester originally, because I have to call her Huldah. It doesn't sound right to me otherwise. And then the other one, which is the one that almost nobody has heard of, is somebody called Noadiah. And Noadiah features in the book of Nehemiah. But Huldah is the person that I want to talk to you about now. So these are women whose names we know who are not enormously well known. Huldah, absolutely fascinatingly, was approached during the reign of one of the kings. Josiah has just found the books of the law in the temple, and he wants to be able to interpret them. And so he goes to a prophet whose name is Huldah. And she explains to the people who come what the books of the law are about, why they're important, and what God wants out of him. And Josiah, as a result, renovates the temple as a response to what Huldah tells him. Somewhat intriguingly, although it doesn't explicitly say so in the story, it says that Huldah was married to someone called Shallum. And Jeremiah the prophet is said to have an uncle called Shallum. So there is a chance that Huldah is Jeremiah's aunt-in-law, which is a nice little kind of connection that you may not know otherwise. But one of the things I think is really interesting is to recognize that in the Bible there are women that we just pay no attention to. They are there in the story, and we just don't notice them. One of the things that I often, people talk to me about is that when I say that I'm absolutely passionate about telling the stories of women in the Bible, they say, well, that's not going to take you very long, is it? Because there aren't very many stories of women in the Bible, they say. And one of the things that I always want to say is that actually there are far, far more than you imagine. And if you made it a discipline to notice the women every time they came up, we would end up telling lots and lots of stories about women from the Bible. Last year, 2023, so it's not last year anymore, is it 2 years ago, I led a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which was looking at women in the Bible. And I spent 10 days with the people who came with me, going around the Holy Land, telling the stories of women as they were in the Bible. And if you lay aside the groups of the women that I spoke about, at the end of the 10 days, we talked about 42 different women. And one of the things that I would really encourage you to do is simply to notice that there are far more women mentioned, reflected on, than we often talk about. And if this Christmas, one of the things that you can do is just notice the women. Notice them when they're there. Notice them whether they're named, and then notice them when they're not named. So I'm coming on to my third category of women, which are the women who we know about, who are not explicitly named in the story, but are there and vital to the story. So we've talked so far about Mary, Elizabeth, and Anna from the Christmas story. We've talked about Huldah, but there are other women as well, and women that I'd like to draw your attention to. Where shall we begin? Let's start with one of the worst stories of Christmas, which is the slaughter of the innocents. We all tend not to read that because we'd prefer not to think about it too much. But the slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem. I think one of the things that we do there is that we focus on the male characters, we focus on Herod giving the order, we focus on the Magi, the wise men who've come to see Jesus, and we entirely forget that of the babies who are slaughtered in Bethlehem, they will all have had mothers. So one of the stories I tell in the Women of Nativity is the story of a mother whose baby is taken by King Herod. And I think this year, when we're reflecting, particularly as we did in our prayers just now, of the mothers who grieve in Bethlehem today, the mothers who grieve in Gaza today, I think telling that story again and remembering that for 2,000 years there have been women in that place in the Holy Land who have grieved the loss of their children. So there are women who we kind of assume are there. There's another one that I just want to talk to you a little bit about, which is actually the birth of Jesus himself. So one of the things that happens when we do our nativity, and you're going to do your nativity, and I can guarantee that you will do is you will probably, I say probably, I'm looking at the person who's organising the nativity, who's probably out with the children, you'll probably have an innkeeper. When you have the innkeeper, just hear my voice in the back going, you've made him up. Because if you remember from Luke's Gospel, actually, all it says in Luke's Gospel is they laid him in a manger because there was no room in the inn. That's the kind of the verse that is mentioned. And therefore, from the inn, incidentally, when my children were little, my eldest daughter came home really, really, really grumpy. I tell you, really grumpy, from the casting of the Nativity play. And she said to me, Mum, why are there no good roles for girls? And incidentally, that's why I lodged that thought in my mind. And then many, many years, she's now 26, but many years later, I wrote a book about all the women they could have cast in the Nativity play, rather than the ones that they did. She got to be the innkeeper's wife's third helper. She was very, very upset about it, for obvious reasons. And one of the things that is problematic is that there was neither an innkeeper, nor a wife, nor a third helper. And the reason why there wasn't is a Greek word, which I will now tell you about. So it's normally translated as Jesus was placed in a manger because there was no room in the inn. Now, there is a perfectly good Greek word for an inn. My next trivia question for you is, where in the New Testament, I'll narrow it down for you, is there a reference to an inn? It's in a parable. If I give you a little... Good Samaritan, yes. You're on fire this morning, aren't you? So in the story of the Good Samaritan, there is the story of, if you remember, the man who's been beaten up by the robbers on the road to Jericho. The Good Samaritan comes and takes him to an inn. And the Greek word for inn in that parable is pandokion, which is a lovely word, actually, because it means, dokion means welcome, and pan means everyone. So a pandokion is a welcome everyone place, which is lovely, isn't it? And there you need to pay your money. It's kind of like our hotels. But actually, the vast majority of places would not have had a pandokion, because you wouldn't have needed one in the culture in which Jesus lived. If there were, and the reason why they had a pandokion in the Good Samaritan is because it wasn't anywhere. It was on the road between a place, so there were no houses. But if you go to a town where there were houses, you would not need a pandokion. Because basically what you would do is you would come and you would knock on the door and you would say, here I am a traveller, will somebody take me in? And the rules of hospitality would say, yes, of course we'll take you in. So when Jesus was born in Bethlehem, there was not that there was no room in the inn, because they didn't need an inn. The word that is used, that is translated in normally, is kataluma. And the word Kataluma means the place where guests come and stay when they come and stay. And here's a really intriguing bit, which I absolutely love. The word Kataluma is used twice in Luke's gospel. Once for there was no room. They laid him in a manger because there was no room in the Kataluma. The other one is in the Last Supper, when Jesus sends his disciples to find a place where they can celebrate the Last Supper together. That's also a Kataluma. But you wouldn't know because of the way in which it's translated into English. And what it means, therefore, is there's a space in the house where people who don't live there can come. They can come and have a meal, they can come and sleep. And the idea is that you would say, of course, in you come. So the reason why I'm telling you all of that in great detail is Jesus was born in a house. And probably what happened was that the people lived on a mezzanine level. And there would have been a corner in the corner for guests. So there was no room in the guest corner. So what they'd have done is put him in a manger on the ground floor where all the animals were. Because the animals were kept in the houses in rural places in this period. So therefore, it had been placed with all the animals because there was such a crush of people in wherever you were, all the people were. It was safer for him to be placed down where the animals were. And the reason I'm telling you all of that is because if Jesus was born in a house, he would have been delivered by a midwife. Because in ancient world, there would always have been a wise woman in the town or the village, probably more than one, who would have delivered babies. So therefore, you need to take out of your head this idea of there being a stable and they're out in the middle of nowhere and there was no one around, and Joseph entirely unlikely delivered the baby. Really probably didn't happen. So therefore, what you need in your nativity story is a midwife. And I think a midwife, and all of us who have had children will tell you how vital midwives are for the delivery of babies. So the reason I'm telling you all of that is that you can find women in the story, even if they're not named, if you use your imagination properly. And I want to end with the story of another woman. And she's one of the women who haunts me, actually. And I've been wanting to write a story about her for years. So given the opportunity, I then did. And it's the story of Herod's wife. And we don't hear anything about her in the Bible. But we do actually know quite a lot about her. And I've spent a long time thinking about her and what it must have been like to be her. So we know that at the time that Jesus was born, Herod was married to somebody who was called Mariamne. And Mariamne actually is known in the ancient world as Mariamne II. And she's known as Mariamne II not because a previous king had been married to somebody called Mariamne, but because one of Herod's former wives had been called Mariamne. So he had his first wife, Mariamne, and actually Mariamne I was his second wife. And here is the best bit of trivia I am going to tell you in the entirety of my life. The name of Herod the Great's first wife, Doris. Isn't that just the best piece of trivia you will ever know? And I swear you will never forget it now. So Herod the Great was married to Doris, then he was married to Mariamne, and then he married another Mariamne. And the story about Mariamne I is utterly tragic. So he divorced Doris when he became king, and instead married Mariamne I. Mariamne I was a Hasmonean princess. So if anyone has heard of the Maccabees were the people who established a dynasty before the time of Herod. And one of the remaining people from that dynasty was Mariamne. And so when Herod became king, and incidentally had no right at all to be king, what he tried to do was marry someone which would mean that he had the right to be king. So he married Mariamne I. And he loved her. He loved her. It was very, very clear from all the literature that he was absolutely, madly, deeply in love with Mariamne I. But because she was a Hasmonean princess, he was absolutely terrified that she was going to stage a coup against him, because she had more right to the royal throne than he did. So he spent his entire life absolutely terrified that she would overthrow him. And in the end became so paranoid that he had her executed because he was so afraid that she was going to overthrow him. And he never recovered. You can tell from various of the texts that he was absolutely devastated by the loss of Mariamne I. So then he heard the story of a new priest who had arrived in Jerusalem from Alexandria, who had a daughter called Mariamne. She was, by all reputes, very beautiful, and he wasn't allowed to marry her because he was a king and her father was just a priest. So he got rid of the high priest and made her father high priest instead, so that he was able to marry her, because she was then the daughter of a high priest. And then he married her. Can you imagine what it must have been like to be Mariamne II, knowing that Mariamne III had been killed by an absolutely paranoid, power-crazy husband, and there you were, sitting in the royal palace, wondering what was going to happen to you. And then 3 magi come, saying, we're looking for the king who has been born. Herod goes into an absolutely frenzy, mad rage. How good are you feeling as Mariamne II? So what I did in one of the stories was imagine what it might have been like to be Mariamne II. And that's what I mean about looking really closely between the lines of the text to find stories of women that really resonate with us, which are deep and profound. So what I've been trying to do this morning is to tell you that actually there is something very important in our Bible reading about how we read. Because one of the things that we're very familiar with is that we kind of read the stories, and I don't know about you, but I do it all the time, where the story begins and you go, yeah, I know this one. And then you don't really listen because you're so familiar with, especially when we come to the birth narratives, we know the stories about the shepherds and the wise men and everything, and we don't really pay very close attention. What I'd love you to do this year is, when the very, very familiar stories come along, ask questions about the people you don't normally notice. I'm obviously really interested in the women for very obvious reasons, but there are other people to pay attention to. What was it like to be a shepherd? What was going on for the shepherds when they came to worship Jesus? What did it feel like for them? What about the magi, the wise men, when they were coming? Can you imagine what it might have been like to be them? What about the people who are both named as minor characters and people who are not named? And what happens when we really notice them? And I'd like to end by just drawing your attention to what has happened for me as I've played my kind of really strongly noticing theme of reading the Bible. What I've noticed is that I've become really aware of the people whose stories we don't normally talk about, then and now. One of the things that happens, as I'm sure you know over and over again, is that we still love hero narratives. The hero where we have one person, and it is normally a man, though not exclusively these days, where we just tell their story. But around them are people who have put all the effort in, who've worked really hard. They have stories of joys and hope and losses and bereavement and expectation. And often in life, we ignore them. We just tell the story of the one person, the hero person. When you start paying attention to the details in the biblical text of the people who are not the heroes of the story, but the bit characters, then you suddenly realize that as we tell our stories today, we also need to pay attention to the people whose names we often don't mention. Sometimes they are, exactly as in the Bible, people whose names we know and we don't ask questions about them. There are also a whole load of people whose names we don't know, and we even more don't ask questions about them. And what I've learned as you read very carefully stories that you know very well is that actually there is one most important thing that you can do when you're reading the Bible and you're living your life. Pay attention. Pay very, very close attention both to what you're told and what you're not told. And as you do that, you begin to realize that the God who loves us is at work both in the named and the unnamed, the people with voices, the people without voices, the people with well-known stories, the people whose stories you're never going to hear. And I would say it is absolutely transformative. So I wish you a very happy Christmas journey this year, from Advent Sunday all the way through to Christmas tide. And I hope that as you journey, you will be able to hear the voices of the named and the unnamed, the noticed and the unnoticed, the people whose stories we know very well, the people whose stories we've never heard of. And as you go, may your story be transformed by that. Amen.
Thank you, Paula. I'm not going to add much other than to say, would we let that challenge, clear and simple, to pay attention as we journey through this Advent? Would that be the thing that travels with us? Would we take the time to pay attention? We're going to sing together another carol in a moment. While we do this, we will take the offering for the work that we do here in this community all throughout the work. If you are able to, anything you can give really helps us to be able to deliver all that we do here in this community. But of course, there is no obligation to give. If you'd like to find out about giving regularly, you can do so. There's leaflets just over at that desk there. But for now, let's stand, if you're able, as we sing together.